Don't wanna complicate you, complicate. Oh man, I love that song. Don't you love that song? Let's all sing together. Okay, I'm assuming you're all doing that on your own time. Welcome back to the podcast, episode 5, a little bonus episode. We're only gonna do one short story in this episode, but there's gonna be a lot of discussion about it. Because this short story influenced many of my books. Let's say 3 out of 4 books. All my collections of short stories were published because of this one short story. And I'll tell you why after we read it. I hope you enjoy this episode. This episode is being uploaded immediately after the previous episode because I've been slacking on the podcast, so I'm trying to get out some more content as a way to seek retribution, to pay penance for my crimes, to seek forgiveness from the audience, my eager and desiring fans. Okay, I can't keep that straight up. Alright, I hope you enjoy this episode. Yeah, it should be fun. In today's bonus episode, we will be reading a short story called The Man from 200. The prompt for this story is: every person in the world undergoes a goodness test. It's designed to give a score from 1 to 200, where 1 is pure evil and 200 is an angel in human body. Then the world is divided into 200 zones where people can live among their own kind. I don't have it too bad, is what they'd say. Everyone could be pure evil. I didn't know that. We weren't allowed outside the walls. No one was. We 146s were a pretty large group, actually. 7 million people live in the city. We were pretty good, so I'm told, but I had nothing to compare us to. I wanted to get out and explore. I finally got my chance one night. I spent a few months building a ladder out in the woods. It reached 50 feet in the air. That night, as I reached the top of the wall, the ladder collapsed underneath me. I was on the top, but I had no way down. The wall was only about 5 feet wide, but no one had broken through before. I walked along the edge of the wall slowly. If I lost my balance, that would be it for little old me. Some zones were small and some were enormous. All around the 146s were other large zones. A small marker identified them as 145s, 147s, 136s, and 156s. They all looked pretty similar to our own group. 136 had a little bit more trash on the streets, and 156 was a bit smaller, but overall nearly identical. I walked for a few miles. It took a lot of space to fit 10 billion people comfortably. I passed by a marker that said 166. This group had less skyscrapers and a few more farms. It was noticeably smaller than my own city, however. It only took about an hour to walk along its wall. As I passed the 160s, I came along 176th city, followed by an even smaller 186. These cities smelled nicer. The air was clean, the streets were safe, and families had each other over for company often. I watched 186 for a few hours before my curiosity got the best of me. 196 had about a dozen people living there. Half a dozen houses filled about a block's worth of space. All the citizens were having a cookout, each one doing his or her own part to help prepare. Everyone waited for their food before they ate. I didn't see one person frown. Beyond 196 was a vast ocean, so I turned and walked upwards. 197 had 9 people living there, 198 had 5, and 199 had a man and a woman. Curious, I thought. When I reached the corner, I was surprised to see that only a log cabin was sitting in plot 200, lying on the edge of a pond. I desperately wanted to know who lived in that cabin. I eyed the water, and then I jumped, landing feet first and sinking deep. I surfaced and hopped out of the pond, shaking off. Slowly, I walked to the cabin, which had a trail of smoke wafting out the chimney. I stood on the porch and knocked on the door. A tall man with a white mustache and kind blue eyes opened the door. "Hello," I said, unconsciously wringing my shirt. "I'm from 146. I just wanted to meet the person living in 200. He smiled. I know. Please, come in, he said, opening the door and letting me in. It was a cozy cabin, very warm and inviting. It had a strange sense of feeling like home. Would you like some tea? He asked. I nodded. All right, then. Sit by the fire while I fix you your tea. I must say, I think you'll quite enjoy it. The raging fire in the fireplace was a welcome feeling. I sat on the floor and let my clothes dry. The man handed me a cup and sat down in a large armchair. Tell me about your journey, he said, sipping from his own cup. I delved into what had happened. I told him of my ladder and of the city of 146. I told the man about the other cities and how fascinating it was to see how differently they lived. I said how I wished I could live in a higher number city. Yes, I was greatly saddened when my children separated you all. Humans are meant to be together, not separate. Often when people reach my home, they are astonished to find how different some of these people actually are. Other people have gotten here? I asked him curiously. He smiled kindly. Why, yes, others have, although I do not call this place my home. My home is much grander than this place. I wait here for people to reach me before I bring them home. I sat for a second, sipping tea. Sir, what is in the other corner? I asked him. His smile faded. Another man lives there, although his home is not a kind place. He entraps his visitors, and they are tortured forever. You are wise to have traveled here instead, he said. Another silence. I'm afraid that you cannot return to the city of 146, my friend. But I can take you to my house, where many of your kin waits. Would you like to go there and live with me? How could I refuse? I nodded and said, Very much so, sir. His smile brightened, and all at once I felt like singing and dancing. Very well. Sleep now, and when you awake, you shall be with me in the merriest feast you will ever see. The celebration of celebrations is coming soon. He took my cup, and I curled up on his carpet, the heat of the flame on my back. Slowly, I drifted off into a perfect sleep, eager to participate in the feast. Oh boy, oh boy. That story was called The Man from 200, and it is one of the most influential stories I've ever written, at least influential to my own life. It's not necessarily a good story. It's not bad. I think it's an interesting concept. I think there are some bugs that you could definitely iron out. You could update that story, change it a little bit. I think if I ever do put that in a bigger collection of short stories, I will edit it. It is, right now, in my first book, fantastical. Yeah, but I don't necessarily believe it's that great of a story. It's not bad, but yeah, it's just a little bit simple. But for some reason, it got a lot of attention, more attention than any other short story I've ever written. I wrote it on Reddit, wrote it in about, 15 minutes or so, maybe less, and responded to the prompt. And a few days later, I had well over 2,500 upvotes. People just liking my post and a lot of comments, a lot of replies to it. And it generated a lot of discussion. And I tried to reply to every single comment I got on that short story. I wrote it over 3 years ago, and I just wanted to reflect on some of the things people were saying about it. This short story is where I really cemented the idea that the story is not my own. It's the death of the author. I've talked about this a little bit on this podcast, but the short stories that I write and the poems I write and everything that I write is not my own. As soon as it is out there, it is the readers, it is the listeners, it's the audience's tales. You are meant to insert yourself in. You're supposed to see yourself in these stories. Doesn't mean you can't look at who wrote it and what you think it means to them, but that matters more than what I think it means or how it means to me. it is up to your interpretation. And I got a lot of different interpretations for this short story. Depending on who you are, I honestly just take a minute, maybe even pause the podcast and think about what the short story meant to you. Who were the characters? What happened in that short story? Don't worry, you can take all the time you need. I'll be here when you get back. Anyway, some of the short story interpretations I got on Reddit, the most upvoted comments on it was a small question. Did the old guy kill the poor jerk with tea? And he didn't use the word jerk, but this is a family-friendly podcast. I got a lot of that interpretation, like, oh, the man from 200 killed the main character. Killed the boy that came to visit with tea or something like that, or whatnot. Some people said the man in 200 was secretly the man that was in 1. I got a comment. I got the impression that there was no one was at 200, and he went to 1, and the guy tricked him into going to hell. And then people were replying to that saying, am I the only one who thought the guy in 200 was a nice guy? And that made me think, like, generate some discussion on, do we assume that characters in short stories often have an ulterior motive, have an agenda, are secretly bad when they're really just good? And every story we read, I noticed that a lot with, like, Dumbledore. If you haven't read the Harry Potter series, then you might not understand this, but some people are like, Dumbledore's a real big jerk, and he's always got these ulterior motives and everything like that, and some people are like, Dumbledore's the nicest guy ever. Yeah. So some people in my short story were thinking the man from 200 was secretly a bad guy, or might have killed the main character. And I'm not saying that's not correct. And then that led to discussions on, do we prefer happy endings or sad endings? Do we expect happy endings or sad endings? When we write short stories, do we write more happy endings or sad endings? One guy commented and said, I was happy with this one. Everyone on this website thinks they need to add some crazy twist that stuns everyone, and I hate it. It could become so predictable. Why can't the guy just be a nice guy and everything was all good for the boy? I replied to that and said, I prefer happy endings too. I'm not big on writing twists, although I did put a sort of twist ending-ish thing in my book. I was still commenting on this, like, people cared. Yeah, I was teasing my book long before it actually came out. People were saying someone that was rated 1, or people that lived in 1, would have no issue getting into the 200 area. A guy commented on this and said, I like this one, although it looks like it has a flaw. What would happen if the main character chose to live instead in, say, 196, or a little lower instead of 200? Unless he had no real choice to walk into 200 and drop in under the guise of curiosity. I replied to that 3 years ago, and I said, I think eventually the only choice he could have made was 1 or 200. Of course, I just told the story. I don't know what the rules of the world are. Someone replied to the first guy, said, would the people of 196 really have him? Separating was a human decision based on the story. Chances are they'd make him leave. I joked and I said, pretentious 196 snobs. Only 190s kids will get this. Good memes. It's just a really fun discussion. What would the people in the cities just lower than 200, like 196, 197, what would living in those be like? What would the people be like? Because they're just barely not perfect. They're just barely not 200 level. Someone commented, said, what if it was a person with a lower number that decided to separate the world? I mean, it doesn't sound good to tell someone they can't live within your society when they're dissatisfied with their own. At least not, I'm 4 points away from God level of good. Is it God deciding that they're 4 points away from him, or is it the people deciding that they're 4 points away from God? I replied to that. I said, God says in the story that he doesn't like the idea of separation. Humans definitely did this, but none of them could reach 200 level goodness. Someone commented, one of the higher level comments said, sounded to me like the tall guy in 200 was the devil, and because he left his hometown, he was being immoral by spreading his immorality to those who didn't deserve it. He is the entrapper and torturer. His house is hell that he is bringing him to. He is the feast that the tall guy is bringing him to. The heat of the flame represents hell, and the perfect sleep is death. So when the main character falls asleep by the fire and he feels the fire on his back, this person is speculating that, oh yeah, this is a symbol of him going to hell. This is a symbol of him dying and being thrown into the eternal fire. I replied to that. I said, I think that's a fantastic interpretation. I just tell the stories. I don't know that much about them. And this same person that had this theory replied to my comment there and said, are you serious that you don't actually have an actual set of interpretation that you would consider correct? I find that so fascinating and yet irritating. I want to know. Please tell me I'm right or wrong so I can get on with my life. I think that's hilarious, personally. Like, they're just so fascinated by the story that they need to know how it was intended. I think that's why I liked English class so much, and I like literature and I like reading, is because I don't want to know what the actual interpretation is. I want to make it my own interpretation. I want to know. I want to be part of the story. I want to participate in the story. And I think that's why reading is so cool, is because it's not reading about someone else. You're actively participating. You're putting yourself in the story. Especially if you read a book before you watch the movie. If there's a book in a movie, you get to imagine it like it's a movie in your own head. I replied to that guy that said he was fascinated yet irritated. And I told him what my interpretation is. I don't even know if I'm going to tell you. But after I said that, I said, I'm a firm believer in making the story you read yours. It's critical thinking. He said, I find it interesting that my lack of trust leads me to mistake God for the devil. That's food for thought, isn't it? I was talking with someone in this comment section about that they believe the authors don't own their stories, or at least their opinion is no more valid than anyone else's when it comes to the story. I replied and I said, if it's something way out of left field, I'll probably step in and say, that's not what my story's about, but otherwise it's mostly to the reader. And yeah, like, if someone's reading my story and saying I'm, like, encouraging to overthrow the government or encouraging to genocide or whatnot, I'm gonna step in and say, that's definitely not what my story's about, and I'd appreciate it if you didn't muddy my words like that. But mostly it's to the reader. It's your interpretation. One of my favorite comments in this section, it only got 12 upvotes, but someone said, you sound like a 198 kind of guy. That's one of the nicest things anyone's ever said to me. And I replied, I said, that's incredibly generous of you. I'm nowhere near that close, but thanks for the compliment. And right underneath that, someone said, you're such a cool person. I think I love you. I love it. It's great. Someone replied, said, I thought that joining him in the feast at the end of the story meant that the kid that was wandering around from 146 was going to become supper. Yours is a much cheerier thought. And I replied, I said, I've heard this theory a lot, which is deeper than it seems, because it means that 200 is far from perfect. He got into that position some other way. The system isn't perfect, he escaped his city, or he runs the system in the first place. Suddenly, a nice friendly tale becomes terrifying. Yeah, like, if the person in 200 is evil, the system obviously doesn't work, and it's corrupt and whatnot, and I'd assume whoever put this whole system together is trying to prevent corruption by keeping each goodness rating, however you determine that, in its own city. And if person in 200 is corrupt, then maybe the people at the bottom of the scale are good. Like, how do you determine that? Someone said, I was under the impression it was a sleeping drug and the old guy's gonna eat him. Don't want to poison your food before you eat it. The person who posted this writing prompt said, I didn't know what fits the setting for the story better. It could have been a sci-fi action like we got a bad boy who's in love with a good girl, or maybe it's a philosophical drama, or both, but the way you see and feel this world is just awesome. It's really nice. It was really encouraging, because this is for the first time that people like really enjoyed my work. Like, a lot of people really enjoyed my work. I've gotten some compliments here and there, but this was the first time, like, on a pretty wide scale, people enjoyed it. Someone had a question for me. Said, question. Was there an illusion in Area 199 where the man and woman were? Is that supposed to relate to Adam and Eve? I got a very biblical vibe from this story, and I enjoyed it. And that took me by surprise. I said, honestly, I have no idea. I guess they're a little bit like a better version of Adam and Eve. They must have just recently been put into 199 because there's only 2 of them. Imagine they're husband and wife in a near perfect marriage. But the scary part is, what's the one point they're off on? I suppose because God or / white mustache guy is in 200. They can never be God, so they're just there in 199. Yeah, like... who, like I was saying earlier, who are put into the just barely not 200 categories. And then I've also realized if there's only 2 people in 199 and we could call them Adam and Eve, there's 5 people in 198 and we could call them, I think, Adam and Eve, and then Cain, Abel, and Seth. And like, you could just imagine going down and down, the world keeps getting worse and worse and worse, and that does feel very biblical. Someone commented, said, something about how naive the narrator is and how gentle the story is lovely. I thought it'd bother me if any of the stories under this prompt felt too vague, but I love this. And as I was reading it back just now, I realized it is very vague. It is a very vague story. But this person loves how naive it is. I imagine the person who wrote this story is probably just a kid. Probably just like a young teenager. I also realized while I was reading this story back, the wall is only like 50 feet high, which when I wrote it 3 years ago or so, let me see, August 2016. When I wrote it, I don't know, 50 feet seemed a lot higher. But just thinking back, that's not that high. Someone said a wave of peacefulness just washed over me after I read the story. Someone commented with a single sentence, said, is this a reference to Jacob's ladder? And I hadn't even thought of that interpretation. Someone climbing a ladder to get to heaven, basically. I hadn't thought of that, but that's a great way to interpret it. Someone commented, said, this is nice, though it makes me think it must be lonely to be a higher number. I replied, I said, I don't know. 1 is the loneliest number. Maybe. Goodness knows the Wicked's lives are lonely. I was really into Wicked back then. Yeah, but would it be lonely to be a higher number? Someone said, I think that him drifting into sleep, waiting for the feast, was like going to heaven, kind of like the end of the movie AI, which I've never seen the movie AI. But yeah, drifting into sleep, going to heaven, that's an interpretation. Honestly, I didn't see as much as I thought I would, but yeah. Someone said this was the first story they read on writing prompts and they loved it. It was a great find, they said. Which, man, that made me happy. Someone said, oof, that gave me shivers. Great work. Someone said, this really gave me a Narnia C.S. Lewis-esque vibe. Sounds a lot like the Aslan and embodiments in his universe. And I said, that's exactly what I was going for. I really wanted the cabin in 200 to feel a lot like Mr. Tumnus's house. And just a little sense of wonder and, again, naivety. Yeah. Someone replied, "It's the multitude of interpretations that really made this story." And I think that's actually very helpful. It's not just the story, it's the comment section underneath. It's the multitude of interpretations. How people are seeing the story and inserting themselves in the story in the real world. Some people are thinking that 200 is a bad guy. Some people are thinking 200 is a good guy. Some people think the kid died. Some people think he didn't. It's really, that's what makes the story. This is why this story is so special to me. It's not the story, it's the comment section underneath. Oh man. This was honestly the most amazing story I've seen on here. I would ask for more, but I really don't know how this could be topped. Anyway, keep up the good work. The most amazing story they've ever seen on here. Wow. Like, even reading it back now, it's not that good. I mean, it's alright, but I don't know. I'm just incredibly humbled, and I was incredibly humbled reading this when it was happening, just replying to all the comments. The most amazing story. It's yeah, I don't even have words. No words. Someone commented, said, "I love this, but the end is so sad." Well, based on the other comments, the perceptions range from sad to twisted to sweet. So many good interpretations. Holy cow, you have a wonderful way with words. Yeah, like, depending on how you interpret it, it's a sad story or it's a really nice story. Someone commented, said, "Anyone else thought the guy in 200 was Morgan Freeman?" I said, "I'm looking into hiring him to act in the movie." Morgan Freeman. Yeah, alright. That's the tale of The Man from 200. I wrote a sequel to that short story because I was like, I gotta capitalize on this. And it didn't do as well. And I think that short story is a little bit worse. It's got some other interesting ideas. I might include it some other time. But The Man from 200 is one of the most powerful stories I've ever written. It's changed my life. Without it, I wouldn't have published Fantastical, probably, because I hadn't written that many short stories beforehand. And when I wrote that, I was like, alright, I gotta make a book. I put 19 short stories together and I published them. And the rest is history. So, hats off to you, The Man from 200. Yeah. Bum bum ba da ba ba boom ba da da. Oh man, I still love that song. It's such a good song, isn't it? Yeah, thanks for listening to this bonus episode of the podcast of TDWrites. I didn't even say it in the beginning. Yeah, thank you so much for listening, for patience, for kind compliments I've got. Some people have asked me, hey, when are you gonna release another episode? So, here I am. No promises on when the next one will be. I was trying to do it weekly, but I'm not going to stress myself. I will try to get a few more out for the first season. I want to get at least minimum 8 episodes of TDWrites out for a season of telling my stories, telling my tales, being a bard that I was meant to be. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time. Okay, bye. This is TDW.